In the year 1845, an expedition set sail with two ships on a journey into the frozen Canadian Arctic archipelago. Their goal? To discover a shortcut, a passage that would connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific through the Canadian North Pole. But shortly after the journey began, 5 crew members fell ill. The expedition had no choice but to leave them behind on an island in Greenland and continue forward with 129 men. 129 souls. None of them would ever be seen again. For over a century, no one knew what happened to those ships or the men aboard them. But in recent decades, we started to uncover the truth. And what really happened to them was far more terrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. Welcome, everyone. Today, let me tell you the chilling story of the Lost Franklin expedition. But before we begin, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell button so you never miss a story. And let's try to hit 100 likes before the next episode drops. At the start of the 19th century, as the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, the world entered a new age of exploration. With the invention of steam engines for the first time in history, the edges of the world felt closer than ever before. By the time 1845 arrived, explorers had mapped almost every corner of the Earth. Almost. There was still one last blank spot on the map, a stretch of frozen coastline over 1,600 kilometers long, deep within the Canadian Arctic. For many explorers, it became a lifelong obsession to find the legendary Northwest Passage, a shortcut through the Arctic, connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. But this path wouldn't reveal itself easily. It would become the graveyard of countless British sailors. At the time, Britain, alongside a few other global powers, was expanding its reach across the world. And back then, expansion meant sailing. But they faced one massive problem: the Americas. The entire continent was a natural barrier, and since the Panama Canal didn't exist yet, ships had only two options: either sail all the way around the tip of South America or go the long way around the globe. Both options were painfully slow, but if a shortcut could be found, a hidden path through the ice, then a journey from England to China would be much faster. More speed meant more trade, and more trade meant more profit. That's why discovering the Northwest Passage became one of the Royal Navy's most important missions. That's why in the early 19th century, the Royal Navy launched a series of expeditions, all in an attempt to chart this elusive route. But none of them found what they were looking for. By the mid-1800s, the Royal Navy decided to make one final attempt. The plan? To send a new expedition west through Lancaster Sound, then head south, covering nearly 1,670 kilometers through dangerous, uncharted Arctic territory. It would be an extremely difficult journey, but whoever succeeded would be rewarded with fame, glory, and a place in history. The only question was, who would lead it? At first, the Navy couldn't make a decision. Sir John Barrow, a high-ranking official in the Admiralty, and the man in charge of preparing the mission, was already 82 years old. He dreamed of ending his career with one final legendary success. But who could command such a dangerous voyage? His first thought was Sir William Edward Parry, a legendary polar explorer. Parry was born in Wales in 1790, and in 1827, he held the record for reaching the furthest point north of any explorer at the time. Over his naval career, he led 4 separate expeditions into the Arctic. But when Sir Barrow approached him to lead this one, Parry declined. He was simply done with the Arctic. Barrow's second choice was Sir James Clark Ross. Born in 1800, Ross was another veteran explorer who had spent 5 decades in the Royal Navy. He had led 6 expeditions to the Arctic and even one to Antarctica. But once again, Barrow was met with refusal. Ross had just gotten married, and he had promised his wife he would never again set sail on a dangerous polar mission. That left one final candidate, a young officer named James Fitzjames. At first glance, Fitzjames seemed like an odd choice. He was born in 1813, which made him only 31 years old at the time. Yes, he was a promising naval officer, having joined the Navy at the age of 12, and rising quickly through the ranks due to his intelligence and education. But some believed his rapid promotions weren't entirely earned. While in Singapore, Fitzjames had a secret encounter with George Barrow, the son of Sir John Barrow. No one knows exactly what happened, but it's rumored that Fitzjames paid people off to cover up something George did, something scandalous enough to ruin his father's name. In return, Sir John Barrow owed him a favor and helped him move up quickly within the Navy. Fitzjames was made captain of a ship at just 29 years old. Still, despite Cerbero's support, the Royal Navy refused to let him command the expedition. Their reasoning, he simply didn't have enough experience. The next candidate was Captain Francis Crozier. Crozier was born in 1796 to a modest Irish family. He was a close friend of Captain Ross, and like the others before him, he was an experienced polar explorer. Over his 38 years of service, Crozier had led 6 major expeditions to both the Arctic and Antarctic. On paper, he was the perfect man for the job. But there was one problem. He was Irish, and from a humble background. The British establishment didn't want the man who would fill in the last blank spot on the world map, the man who would discover the most important sea passage in history, like to be Irish. So, instead of leading the mission, Crozier was demoted to second in command. But that still left one question. Who would be the official leader of the expedition? The fifth choice was Sir John Franklin. At the time, Franklin was 59 years old, with 45 years of service in the Royal Navy. He was born in 1786 to a well-off family and was the only one of his siblings to join the Navy. He steadily rose through the ranks, serving in multiple wars, including the French Revolutionary War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the War of 1812. He had also joined 2 previous polar expeditions, but unfortunately he was most famous for one that went horribly wrong. In 1819, he led what became known as the disaster of the Coppermine Expedition. Out of 20 men, 11 died, most from starvation. Those who survived only did so by eating the leather from their own boots. That earned Franklin an infamous nickname, the man who ate his boots. Despite the failure, Franklin was respected by his men. He was known as a kind, religious, and caring leader. And for him, this Arctic expedition was a golden opportunity, a chance to redeem himself and rewrite his legacy. He accepted the offer, and just like that, the search for a leader came to an end. The Royal Navy officially appointed Sir John Franklin as the commander of the expedition. Francis Crozier would serve as his second in command, taking charge of the HMS Terror, and James Fitzjames would command the second ship, the HMS Erebus. The 2 ships chosen for the journey were considered the best possible vessels for such a mission. The HMS Erebus was a modified warship, originally built in 1826. It was 32 meters long, 9 meters wide, and crewed by 67 sailors. The HMS Terror, slightly older, was built in 1813. It had similar size and firepower to the Erebus. Both ships were chosen because they were warships, and warships were built with reinforced hulls to handle cannon fire. That made them much better equipped to endure the crushing pressure of Arctic ice. Even more impressive, they were fitted with the latest technology of the time. These were the first Royal Navy ships ever equipped with steam engines. Each had a 25-horsepower steam engine, capable of pushing the ship at a speed of 4 knots, about 8 kilometers per hour. They also had a special bronze propeller, which could be retracted into the hull to protect it from damage in icy waters. And the steam pipes running through the ships weren't just for propulsion. They doubled as an early form of central heating to help the crew survive the brutal Arctic temperatures. But those steam engines came with a cost. They required nearly 1 ton of fresh water every hour. That meant the ships needed another piece of critical equipment, a seawater desalination system. This would supply fresh water not only for the engines, but also for the crew to drink, cook, and survive for months at sea. The ship hulls themselves were reinforced with iron plating, especially at the front and middle. The original wooden structure was simply too weak for the harsh ice. You could say these ships were the space shuttles of their time, equipped with the most advanced technology the 19th century had to offer. On May 19, 1845, the Franklin expedition officially set sail. Aboard the 2 ships were 134 men, carrying supplies meant to last 3 full years, and possibly 5 if rations were reduced. They had 2 tons of tobacco, 7,500 liters of alcohol, a library of 1,200 books, and most importantly, 16,000 tins of preserved food. For the first time in naval history, an entire crew would rely entirely on canned food, a cutting-edge innovation at the time. The ships left London and sailed north toward Scotland, then crossed the Atlantic, heading for the whaling stations off the west coast of Greenland. But before reaching Greenland, 5 crew members fell seriously ill. They were too sick to continue the journey and were discharged from the expedition. Those 5 were the lucky ones. They were the only men who would survive. While staying on the island in Greenland, the rest of the crew wrote their final letters home. In those early days, morale was high. They were about to begin the greatest voyage of their lives, a mission they believed would cement their names in history. And it did, but not for the reasons they hoped. On July 12th, 1845, the expedition set off once again, this time with 129 men. 2 weeks later, they were spotted by a group of whalers in Baffin Bay. That would be the last time anyone would ever see the ships, or the men aboard them. Sailing in the Arctic is unlike anywhere else on Earth. Even in summer, the waterways are clogged with ice. Ships must constantly push and ram massive blocks out of the way, and this has to be done very slowly. If they move too fast, the ice could crush the bow and sink the entire vessel. Because of this extreme slowness in their first year, the expedition traveled only about 800 kilometers. They circled around Cornwallis Island but didn't find the passage they were looking for. Eventually, they returned to Beechy Island as winter began to set in just 350 kilometers from Baffin Bay, where they had last been seen. They ended up right back where they had started. But still, the crew considered the first year a success. Now they knew there were no useful passages further north. And because Arctic winters freeze the ocean completely, they took shelter in a small bay between Beechy Island and Devon Island. Once the water froze solid, the crew lowered the sails and covered the ship's upper decks with canvas tarps. They also packed snow around the sides of the ships to insulate them from the freezing wind. With these efforts, they managed to create a somewhat livable environment where they could survive the long, dark winter until spring arrived and the ice melted, allowing them to sail again. During that first winter, 1845 to 1846, morale was high. They had made decent progress before the freeze. They had plenty of food and water, and no one expected what was coming. But that winter, 3 crew members died. They were buried on Beechy Island. More than a century later, in the 1980s, archaeologists discovered their bodies still remarkably preserved in the permafrost. When scientists examined them, the primary cause of death was identified as tuberculosis, and they weren't the only ones. Remember the 5 sick men who were discharged before the expedition entered the Arctic? They also turned out to be infected with tuberculosis. That meant the disease was already spreading within the crew from the very beginning. And in the mid-1800s, tuberculosis was usually a death sentence. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics. Once it took hold, it killed slowly and painfully. When spring came and the ice began to thaw, the ships were freed from the ice, and the expedition resumed its journey south, toward an area known at the time as King William's Land. At that point, it was believed to be part of the mainland. No one yet realized it was actually an island. When they reached the region around Victoria Strait and the newly named Wellington Channel, Franklin faced a crucial decision. Head south and hope it was an island, meaning they could sail under it through a passage, or head west, hoping to navigate through the remaining straits before the next freeze. Franklin chose to go west. He didn't want to risk going south, finding the way blocked, then having to turn back north and try again, possibly too late in the season. But this decision turned out to be a disastrous mistake. The waters west of King William Island are some of the most treacherous in the entire Arctic. Multiple narrow channels converge there, creating massive buildups of sea ice. The region acts like an ice trap. Even in summer, the ice never fully clears, and before they could change course and escape, they became stuck. The ice closed in around the ships and locked them in place, just off the western coast of King William Island. And that's where they would spend their second winter, from 1846 to 1847. But what they didn't know was that this winter would mark the beginning of a real tragedy. As luck would have it, the winter of 1846, and the years that followed, were some of the coldest the Arctic had ever seen. The ice surrounding King William Island never melted, not even during the summer. Back in England in January 1847, Lady Franklin, the wife of Sir John Franklin, began to worry. The expedition was originally supposed to take just 1 year. Now it had been 2 full years with no word. She went to the Royal Navy and urged them to launch a search and rescue mission. But the Navy didn't see any problem. The expedition, after all, was equipped with enough food for 3 years. Why panic now? But Lady Franklin didn't accept that. She launched a wide public campaign, pulling every string she could to pressure the Navy into action. Meanwhile, the truth was, though no one knew it yet, the crew really did need rescuing. Here comes the second major problem we mentioned earlier: the food. The canned food they had brought on board had been poorly preserved. The company contracted to supply the expedition had agreed to produce over 16,000 cans in just 7 weeks, a rush job by any standard. They had won the contract by offering the cheapest bid, but that came at a cost. The cans were low quality and many of them were sealed using lead, which leached into the food and slowly poisoned it. Some of the canned goods hadn't even been properly cooked. The result? Widespread food poisoning. And it wasn't just from the food. The water purification system on board also used lead pipes, and when those pipes came into contact with seawater, the corrosion released even more lead into their drinking water. To make things worse, the crew, like most sailors at the time, relied on lemon juice to fight off scurvy, a deadly disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. But this time, instead of lemon juice, they brought canned fruits and vegetables, believing that would be enough. But due to poor preservation, the food lost its nutritional value over time. And while the crew might not have noticed anything wrong in the first year, or even the second, they were now deep into their third year. On May 28, 1847, the crew sent out a sled team to the shores of King William Island. There, they left 2 notes inside stone cairns, hoping someone might one day find them. The message was simple and direct. It detailed their route up until that point, the location of the ships, and confirmed that Captain Franklin was still in command and everything was under control. But soon after that message was written, things would spiral out of control. They were still hoping the ice would melt and their journey would resume. But the ice, wasn't going anywhere. But in the years 1847 and 1848, the ice never melted. Not in June, not in July, not even in August. The ships remained completely trapped, encased in thick, unrelenting ice. And during the seemingly endless winter, HMS Terror began to sink deeper and deeper into the ice. Most of its crew were forced to abandon it and move over to HMS Erebus to join the rest of the men under Captain Fitzjames. It was warmer that way, and they could ration their remaining food supplies more efficiently. Terror was essentially turned into a giant freezer, used to store extra equipment and the bodies of the dead. Because day by day, more and more crew members were dying. On June 11, 1847, Captain John Franklin himself passed away. The man who had led the expedition, and whose name would later become synonymous with its tragedy, was now gone. It wasn't until the winter of 1847 to 1848 that the British Navy finally began to take action. The public pressure campaign, led by Lady Franklin and supported by newspapers, had been going strong for over a year, accusing the Navy of negligence and delay. Something had to be done. So, in early 1848, the first official search missions were launched. They entered the Arctic from 2 sides, one group coming in through the Atlantic Ocean and another through the Pacific. Among the search party was James Ross, a famous explorer who had previously declined to lead the Franklin expedition himself, as he had just gotten married at the time. But this time he agreed to join, not to lead, a rescue attempt, hoping to find his close friend, Captain Francis Crozier. On April 22, 1848, after being trapped in the same location for over 18 months, Captain Crozier, who had taken command after Franklin's death, made a bold and desperate decision. He would abandon the ships. Staying on board meant waiting for certain death. The men were dying one after another, and there was no help coming. So Crozier gathered 104 surviving crew members. They loaded their lifeboats onto sledges, packed their remaining supplies, and began a long and desperate journey south, on foot. Their goal: to reach Back River, 240 kilometers away. Once there, they hoped to use the boats to paddle toward the nearest trading outpost and finally find help. On April 25th, they reached a cache of stone cairns where they had left earlier messages. They updated one of the letters with new information. HMS Terror and HMS Erebus were abandoned on April 22nd, 30 kilometers northwest of this point. The ships had been trapped in ice since September 12, 1846. The crew now numbers 105 men under the command of Captain Crozier. The total number of deaths so far includes Sir John Franklin, 9 officers and 15 men. Signed, James Fitzjames, Captain of Erebus. The men then began their long, brutal land march, dragging boats that weighed over 3 tons, across ice and jagged rocks, in freezing temperatures. It was hell. The men were suffering from extreme weakness due to malnutrition and lead poisoning. Many were also dying slowly from scurvy. One by one, they began to fall. At first, when someone died, their body would be loaded onto the sledge with the boats, but that only made the load heavier for the others. Now imagine this. A group of starving men, sick from scurvy and lead, some coughing blood from tuberculosis, being forced to walk 240 kilometers through snow, dragging 3-ton boats behind them. They couldn't leave the boats behind. If they ever reached the river, they'd need them. Eventually, the group made a grim decision. Anyone who couldn't keep going would be left behind in a tent, with a bit of food, and a hopeless promise that maybe one day, someone would come back for them. Small groups eventually broke off from the main group. No one knows if they got separated by accident or were abandoned on purpose. All we know is that over 20 bodies were later found along the coast of King William Island in more than 12 separate locations. In 1850, a group of Inuit hunters discovered a deserted ship, later confirmed to be either Erebus or Terror. Inside, they found several crew members still lying in their beds, dead. That discovery led researchers to believe that some of the men had returned to the ship, choosing to die there rather than in the snow. When the Inuit were asked about what they had seen, their testimonies were shocking. They said they saw groups of men eating human flesh, feeding on the bodies of their own dead. They claimed to have found a mass grave with more than 30 corpses, all showing signs of butchery. Their comrades had eaten them. When the British Navy heard this, they denied it outright. They called the Inuit savages and liars. They insisted that no civilized British gentleman would ever commit cannibalism. But by August 1850, a British search party found the graves of the first 3 men who had died and been buried on Beechey Island. That confirmed that something had definitely gone wrong with the expedition. After that, the search for Franklin's lost expedition became more important than the Northwest Passage itself. Over 10 ships were sent to search for the men, but some of them would meet similar fates. One of the rescue ships, HMS Investigator under the command of Robert McClure, ended up discovering the Northwest Passage entirely by accident, while searching for Franklin. But it too became trapped in ice, and its crew had to abandon the ship after being stuck for 2 years. In 1853, the crew of the Investigator encountered survivors from yet another trapped rescue vessel, and together they made it back to safety. Over the following year, and on March 31st, 1854, the British Navy officially declared all members of the Franklin expedition dead in the line of duty. Then, in 1993, 145 years after the expedition began, came the biggest shock of all. Researchers discovered the final camp set up by the surviving men of the expedition on King William Island. When they examined the site, the horrific reports from the Inuit were confirmed. Human bones were found with clear-cut marks, showing that someone had tried to extract the marrow. Clear evidence of cannibalism. Finally, in 2014, the wreck of HMS Erebus was found. The ship was in terrible condition, nearly destroyed. But just 2 years later, in 2016, the second ship, HMS Terror, was discovered. And here's the strange part. It was found in Terror Bay, a bay that had been named after the ship long ago, even though no one knew it had sunk there. Even more incredible, the Terror was almost perfectly preserved. Initial dives brought up a treasure trove of artifacts, but in 2020, everything came to a halt because of the COVID pandemic. It wasn't until May 2022 that the exploration teams were able to resume their work. And who knows? Maybe in the coming years, we'll finally uncover even more secrets about what really happened to the cursed Franklin expedition. That brings us to the end of this chilling story. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you have a story you'd like us to cover, write it down below. If your idea gets enough attention, I'll add it to our weekly vote, and if it wins, I'll turn it into a full episode. So don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might enjoy it. I'll see you next time with a story even more haunting than this one. Take care, and goodbye.